Katie, the concept of home is certainly a very good concept to explore for your series. I think that the images that you have certainly suggest that. Certainly it's a very rich concept that there's a lot that you can really look at. And I would encourage you to explore it more fully as you finish up your schooling and you're prepared to leave. Home means different thing to everybody, but we always kind of cherish those memories, and having some photos to go with that, definitely a good thing. The images that you took, I think, were all generally well exposed. Looks like you probably had your smartphone for these. And one of the things that smartphones are really good at is taking well exposed images of scenes that are captured in bright daylight. We get good colors throughout, and the one exception probably is this one in the door, where we have the door, of course, is in the shade. And what we see here is a little bit of a blue color cast. And so while everything else I think has got very good coloring, I think that the coloring here is a little bit off. One of the ways that you might go about correcting that is using the camera raw filter, and it has a really nice little eyedropper tool that you can just go ahead and click on things that should be neutral. So expect that this little bit of white trim is pretty neutral, although that doesn't look quite right. There's certainly going to be some grays here in the mortar that gets you pretty close, and I think that was actually a pretty good click. You might, since you talked specifically about the vibrant colors of the door, you might even bump up the vibrance a little bit. And we're starting to see this little red overlay. That's indicating a little bit of an overexposure, so we might even bring back some of those highlights a little bit to get a nice balance in between. In terms of composition, I think that this one is pretty solid. You might consider cropping it just a little bit. So what we see here is this vertical of the door is kind of keystoning in, what we call that, where it gets a little bit, looks like it's a little smaller on the top than it is on the bottom. One of the ways that you might address that is with the perspective crop tool. And if we go ahead and just draw around it, now what we do is we take these corners and we bring them in a little bit so that the edge of the frame is parallel with the edge of the door. And we do the same thing on here, somewhere along that line. And click OK, and then you can see how it really straightens up those lines. Little details like that go a long way towards making the images look fully polished. I think we could probably also use a little bit of a contrast, and so for this one I'm going to show you how to use a brightness and contrast tool. It seems pretty straightforward. You push the slider a little bit to the right to brighten things up, and you push the contrast a little bit in the same direction to give it a little bit more. You see how it changes the colors a little bit? So that's the one thing that you need to be a little bit careful about. And of course, like many of these tools, it has an auto button, and it's always worth exploring to see where that gets you. But in this example, it doesn't really change things too much. You can see how that looks. There we go, the auto contrast finally kicked in. And I think that is actually a pretty nice edit. For this particular image, the tops of the trees are a little bit of a distraction. So this is really all about the sign itself, and we just see this little bit here and there of the trees. One thing that you might consider doing is cloning those out. And one of the ways that you can do that is with this patch tool. Now, I always recommend that you do that on a new layer, but it's as simple as dragging around it and then dragging that up into a clear area. And it didn't work, so that's always a good indicator. You need to double check the sample all layers is on and active. And so do it again. And this time you see it went away, but it didn't do a very good edit. So there's two different sliders that you want to experiment with after the fact. So the first is the structure, and I recommend you kind of go both directions with it. So I think 1, it looks like that's actually pretty decent, whereas 7 fully on looks horrible. So I bring that down to 1, and then the other one is color, and we definitely get a little bit of color aberrations down here. So we edit that until it looks like a nice smooth sky rendition. And we can certainly do that with these other trees. We could clone in some clouds to make up the difference. But you can see how even removing that first one makes it much more prominent, the sign much more prominent in the image. And the simplified version is generally a good direction to head in with your imagery. So with this particular image, having your backyard, we see very, very high contrast scenes. So of course the sun is going to be super bright and white, whereas these areas in the shadow in your garden here are pretty dark. One of the ways you might address that is with a shadow highlight adjustment. You can see with the default settings that pop up, we already start to see the more detail here in the garden and behind the shrub. But you can adjust these further if you need to. Before you get too far, you definitely want to change the radius, and that keeps a little bit of contrast in there while we're still brightening it up. It's not making everything look very flat. Highlights, you can bring that in a little bit, and you can see how the sun looks like it's not quite so prominent in the sky. It makes the blue a little bit more enhanced, and I think overall it's just kind of a nice quality change of the image. You can see how that looks. Finally, the image from up on the hill looking out over, I think this is very well exposed. A little bit of foreground here, not really adding a lot. You could probably consider cropping that a little bit, giving it just a regular crop and kind of bumping it up somewhere in there, so it really becomes more about the view from the hill rather than the little bit of dead winter grass that we see here. But I think overall it's a nice image. We get nice colors and nice saturation throughout. Overall, I think it's a good concept for your image, and it's for your series rather, and it's a concept that's well worth exploring further.